team. I guess I will share my screen. Are you recording or do I need to wait a second? Oh, it's recording. Okay, I see it. All right, and share. So, yeah, so here the catchy title is Enhance Your Success with Directional Signage to the Farm. And and so what I'm going to talk about in this webinar is really, is not the signage that you have within your agritourism business to guide people around to different places, because we have aspects of that in other presentations that we've done. My focus today is really thinking about the signage sort of like on the exterior of your business that guides people to your business, and then the signage sort of from wherever people are coming from that gets them to your farm. And it's really important if you think about it. One is, I live in Eastern New York, in the mountains, or near mountains, and I often have to go out to farms, and not all locations in New York, as many of you know if you're from this region, are served by strong cell coverage. And so, if somebody is trying to get to your farm, and even if they've got, people are really phone oriented these days, even if they've got, the directions on Google Maps or whatever, we've all had that experience of trying to get somewhere and then all of a sudden the internet isn't working really well, and we don't have good cell coverage. And that's where really good directional signage, an arrow with a sign that points you off where you're going to go and gives you a sense of where you're going, and clear, like a big welcome sign, can really make you a lot more confident. The other thing is that, if somebody is coming to your business, we've all had that experience of like not being sure where it is, not being sure where it is, and then you like miss the entrance and you got to turn around and it's like really hard to find, and you're not quite sure where the turnoff is going to be, and you're not quite sure where the business is. And then by the time you get there, you're feeling pretty frustrated, and in some cases, if the traffic is bad enough or the turnaround is hard enough, you may just decide that you're not going to make that stop after all. So you want people to come to your agritourism place, whatever it is, feeling good, right? Like not, or, not having got an argument with their, the person that's the navigator or whatever trying to find the place. You want them to like come and be like, wow, that was really easy and we made it. And now we're ready to, pick some apples or, drink some beer or whatever you have. And then finally, really good signage is advertising, so people drive by and they see your sign. They drive by and they see, a sign pointing, like to a winery off to the right or a brewery over there that they maybe didn't even know was there. Or they're driving down the interstate and they see, on one of those big blue signs that has all of what's at this stop, so it can be a way of driving people to your farm. I mean, billboards, these days we tend to like think everything is on the internet, but billboards are still a very powerful tool for communication, and your signage is, also can function much like a billboard is just a really, really big sign, right? But, like signage can really, just for a relatively reasonable amount of money, you just get, you get everybody's eyes on your business, as they drive down the roads or whatever. So depending on where you're located, if you're on a road that has a lot of travelers going through it, directional signage could be a huge part of your, a really important part of your marketing strategy. But the other thing that's to remember is you can't just slap up a billboard or slap up a sign anywhere you want. And actually, the reason I volunteered for this, to do this part of the, this webinar, as opposed to other webinars, is about 10 years ago, I had a farm call me up and they were really, really upset because they had spent a lot of money on signs for their agritourism business as it was. And DOT had come and taken them all and disposed of them. And and they were like, they were really upset about that. It was they had spent a lot of money on that signage, but it turned out it was on, even though it wasn't a state hot road, it was a road that fell under DOT's purview, and it was in the right of way, and they have the right to just take it and get rid of it. And so there's a lot of regulations around roadside. I have this picture on the right, is, an older picture, and a lot of the regulations really come out of, the Johnson administration, Lady Bird Johnson, like beautification. And there was this real concern, as people moved into cars and you had more car traffic, then you saw this proliferation of just advertising everywhere. And you can see like what, there's, you go through historic pictures, it was just like a cluttered mess. And so as a result of that, and as a result of like local zoning and safety and a lot of reasons, there are a lot of regulations on signage. And so if you want to use signage as a tool, you definitely need to be ready for the fact that you need to either, that there are multiple layers often of regulations for signage that you can have. But if you know that from the get-go, you won't be in the situation that farmer that I work with is, where you can spend a lot of money and then find out you can't do it. So what are these regulations? Well, there are federal and state laws and regulations, so that govern the kind of signage you can have on primary roads, either federal highways or state roads, or what are designated as major roads. And the agency that you will work with in order to navigate that process in our state would be New York State Department of Transportation, but that's pretty much true in all of the other states. The one nice thing about this signage presentation is, although I'm going to be talking about New York throughout it, because of the way the federal highway funds are distributed, a lot of the state laws and regulations are responding to the federal laws and regulations. And so the process in other states is probably fairly similar. And so if you're not in New York, I would first reach out to your state Department of Transportation in order to figure that out. It was pretty easy on the New York site to figure out what the process is. And on the handout, I have all of the links to the different agencies that you would contact. But the other place that you need to look for every sign, whether it's on a federal or state road or whatever, is also, signage is often covered by local zoning, zoning laws, safety laws, that also dictate what kind of sign, what size sign you can have. And so if you're going to put up signage, you will also, even on your own property, you may very well fall under zoning regulations and safety regulations. There are going to be rules about like how far the sign has to be set back, what the size of the sign can be, how far away from, it can't block, other directional, things. It can't be a safety hazard. It has to be out of, so there's a lot of rules around signage. So you should also check with your local municipality or county, depending on, what your governmental structure is, concerning any local requirements for a sign before you also invest a lot of money or resources into this. The other reason I have highlighted here is New York State Ag and Markets can assist. If you're in a New York State Ag district and you want to put a sign on your property guiding your, people to your farm, and it doesn't violate any of the federal or state laws and regulations. So it's compliant, you've gone to DOT and everything is kosher. But your local zoning regs, have standards, whether it's design standards or material standards that are a burden. If it's for a production business, it could be that New York State Ag and Markets under the right to farm laws can assist you, because there is there is a program there to help reduce unreasonable local requirements. Now, unreasonable is not anything about safety, so it can't, your sign still can't be a hazard, it can't be, it probably can't be offensive, but it could, but if, if they determine that the build standards or the design standards or the color standards are unreasonable, and it's to like a pick your own or something that is like geared around production agriculture, ag and markets can also help advocate for you in New York. So I also want to define a sign, right? Like this, and these are the New York State definitions. Any outdoor sign, and that could include a display, a device, a figure, this like gnome here, that is, in front of a agritourism business in my area, a figure, a painting, a drawing, a message, a placard, a poster, a billboard, any other thing that is designed and intended or used to advertise or inform any part of the advertising that's visible from the main traveled way of a highway, whether it's permanent or portable, is a sign. So this gnome is a sign by New York State definitions, because it's there to guide you to this farm, and it's like right out in front. And then a right of way is also another concept that's really important to understand, is that New York State maintains a right of way along state controlled roadways. And what is a state controlled roadway is not always apparent. Like that's why you'd want to talk to DOT if it's, unless it's like clearly a small local town road. But the limits of the right of way vary. So sometimes they can be, in more urbanized areas quite small, but in rural areas they could be quite large. And no sign is allowed in a right of way without permission from the DOT. And we'll talk about some programs that can guide you there. And if you put a sign, a private sign, in a state roadway, I can guarantee you they will throw it away if they see it. So, and that's what happened to the grower that I worked with. The other definition that's kind of important is this idea of a primary highway system. And those are New York State roads, county roads, and local roads that the Commissioner of Transportation has certified to the Secretary of Transportation as the major travel routes within the state. And these roads, because of this certification, get federal funding, and therefore they fall under the DOT sign control program. And so all of those regulations around, like whether DOT controls, whether you have to get DOT permission in their process, or whether it's a local control, is whether or not it falls under this primary highway system thing. There are other roads, like within the Adirondack Park, there are specific sign standards within the Catskill Park. There are, within that area, there are design standards along scenic roads, so ones that have those scenic route designations. There are also specific signage rules, and those are not necessarily part of this primary highway system. But those are also, DOT can help guide you through the signage requirements there too. They are still the point of contact for the Adirondack Park, Catskill Park, the scenic highways or scenic routes or whatever. But if you want to have a sense of whether or not a road that you are near is part of this primary highway system, there is a map on this gis.dot.new.york.gov viewer, and you can zoom in anywhere in the state and it'll show you, on the next one, these colored lines here are those designated routes. And this is just like a little zoom into the area around Kingston where I'm located, but it covers the entire state. And other states also have these designated roads. This is a federal program, but this is how it's applied in New York. And the thing is so these would be the roads. If your business is near these roads, then, or you are adjoining these roads, your land, then, you're more like, or you're at an intersection, you're on one of these little brown roads that intersects with one of these roads, then you're more likely to be affected by those DOT regulations, as opposed to whether or not it's the signage is a local issue. So I'm going to cover in this presentation 4 types of directional signage. On-premise signage, and those are the signs that are actually physically on your property, like your entrance sign and other signs that are related to your business on your land, at your agritourism venue. Off-premise signage, those are signs that are not on your property, but that are advertising or directing customers to your business. Anything from a billboard to like a smaller sign that's on private land, but not on that property where the business is. And then there are what they call interstate logo signs, and those are official signs from the Department of Transportation that direct tourists off of interstate highways to services and attractions. And we've all seen them. Those are those big blue signs that like food, next exit, accommodations, attractions, and you just see them as you go down, and they're directing you off that exit ramp. And there is a process that businesses can get there. If you've ever wondered how, Chili's or McDonald's or the gas station get on one of those signs, there is a process that is, possible for businesses to do that. And then they have what they call tourist oriented directional signs, or TODS. And those are also official Department of Transportation signs that direct tourists to attractions off of secondary roads. And I'll have an example of those. So those are the four types of directional signage that we'll talk about. So on-premise signage is the one I think that everybody's pretty familiar with. Signs that are located on the same premises. So according to the Department of Transportation, if you have a sign that is separated from that activity, your bakery, your pick your own or whatever, that, is separated by a roadway or a highway, that's not an on-premise sign. It has to actually be on the premises where the activity is taking place. You also can't buy a little strip of land and put up a sign on it and call it on premises. It has to be, adjacent to or on the premise where the activity is conducted. And those signs are generally local, fall under local zoning. Those tend to be, locally determined, like what you need to do, unless they are adjacent to one of those state routes. And so for example, if you want to put up an on-premise sign like this store and bakery, you pick Orchard sign as an example, and the town says, no, like it's too big or everything has to be brown or whatever, and you're a pick your own farm like this one is, you could talk to to New York Ag and Markets, and they might be able to help you navigate, figuring out what you can do with the sign that's reasonable with the town. Entrance signs tend to be the big one, right? That like most businesses want to do right. So an entrance sign, really should include the business name, right? And some brand identity like a logo. My little thing is going too fast. So if you really want to do this right, you want people to be able to see your name, have some idea like logo, because it's hard sometimes when you're traveling really fast. It's hard to read really quickly, but like you can see the gnome coming from a while, a way away, or a picture is maybe easier. You want to have those open and closed hours. I think like putting a sign out that says open, or a flag, you see that pretty commonly. That's, I think, that really gets a driver's attention quickly. Like when you see that open flag up, as opposed to, it not being there. And then what products or services are for sale. So like, this is a chance once again for advertising. Like you're directing people to your business, but you're also advertising for people who may not be familiar with your business, like that you're there and that you have some products for sale and that they might want to stop. The gnome will get your attention, the corn will get your attention, stuff like that. Now, what off-premise sign, this is the one that's really heavily regulated, right? Like on-premise, in general, it's on your land. You have more control over it usually. Off-premise signage, where you're putting signs, sort of along a road, maybe you've bought, you've got a neighbor who's willing to, for like a certain amount of money to put a sign on their land for your business. They're a wider range of messages. Those can be like billboards. They can be like small posters, oversized. But if that sign is near a New York State highway, it may be subject to New York State and federal laws and regulations. And so if, like, for example, if that sign is within 660 feet of the edge of a right of way and it's visible from an interstate or a primary highway, one of those colored roads, that would be subject to the New York State sign program, which I'll talk about in a minute. So you would have to get a permit from the state to have that sign there. But if it's not, visible from one of those primary roads, then it probably falls within the local or county zoning regulations. If they're more than 660 feet from the edge of the right of way, but it's in a rural area, but it's meant to be seen from a primary highway. So even if it's not right on the primary highway, but it's like maybe it's a big billboard or something and you can see it from a primary highway, it still falls. If it's in that view shed, it's also subject to the New York State sign program and you have to get a permit for it. Advertising signs in non-commercial areas are not permitted within 660 feet of the right of way, like on a main road. And then there are some exemptions though for your on-premise, your entrance signs and stuff like that. And once again, if you're in violation of the state rules, and they will take your signs down. So I think that's just something to be aware of. That these are, and you'd be surprised sometimes where where those roads could be. So the New York State sign program, so if you're anywhere near these main roads, or you think that you might fall under like Catskill Park, Adirondack Park, Scenic Byway or whatever, you want to gather the information that you need, like what you're trying to do with the sign and where you want to put it, and go to their staff, and where you'd like to have it placed. And you go to basically one of the DOT offices, and they have this is the region, so you get a sense of like what region you might be in. But there's a list on their website, and I'll have a link to that website in the document of what office you would go to. And then you would complete a form, right of way 375 and the right of way of 436. Or if it's not, or depending on what you're looking to do, you'd also could apply for one of the logo signs, which I'll talk about, or the directional signs. And then they'll be reviewed, and then you'll be notified, and assuming that you're permitted, you can then put your sign up. But you also still, even if you go through the New York State sign program, that doesn't exempt you from local municipal code enforcement. So you always need to check with local requirements, regardless if you're in the New York State sign program or not, for an off-premise sign. Because we are a local control, we're a home rule state, right? So logo signs, these are the logo signs. If you got like the mainline sign and then ramp signs, it is possible for businesses to get on a mainline sign if you are near a highway interchange. You have to be within a specific distance from the highway in order to be included. So if you have a food business, you have to be within 6 miles of that exit. If it's a lodging, you have to be within 9 miles. Camping is 12, and then attraction is within 15 miles. And it has to be on pretty good roads too. It can't be like on really unsafe or dirt. It has to be like 15 miles of like decent roads to get to that attraction. If you're within that, so if you are within that circumference of a highway, an interstate interchange, then you've crossed the first hurdle. There are a limit often to like how many businesses can be advertised. You do have to cover the cost of the sign and the maintenance. If it's a sign that has like multiple people on it, then I think that it's shared. And then the permit cost per sign is $100 a year per location. So the thing is though, if you think about how many people will see this sign, if you're a business and you're at a location and let's say you've got a little like restaurant or something, or you've got an attraction and you want to like attract people coming off the interstate to it, and and you think it's viable, you've got a lot of eyeballs on this, and certainly it can be, for in the grand scheme of things, not necessarily a ton of money. It could be, a very effective way, resource. If you're a really, really small operation and your revenue's pretty low, it might not be worth it. But if you're scaling up to look at like thousands of people coming to your enterprise every season, then the logo program could make sense for you. A smaller scale version of this is the tourist oriented directional sign. And those are, we've all seen those. They're also, that's a state, slash federal program. So the signage is pretty standard. But they note no nearby businesses with a name and then mile directions and an arrow. And these are classified as traffic control devices. So you have to meet, all the regulations and sign standards. So there isn't a lot of creativity necessarily with them. So usually it's like intersection signs. They usually have a directional arrow. And in New York State, at any intersection, there can be a maximum of 12 businesses at any intersection, 4 to the left, 4 to the right, and 4 straight ahead. Businesses closer to that intersection, if there's more than 4 that want to have a sign, are generally prioritized. They're placed within the state right of way. They require a permit of $50 a year, and then you also have to pay the cost of the sign and the installation. But so like once the sign is there and it's installed, it would be $50 a year to maintain that. But once again, if you have a main road, in a reasonable amount of distance, and in this case, you have to be within 5 miles of the highway, like that interchange containing that directional sign. In some circumstances, you can be more than 5 miles away if you're a significant tourist interest by DOT. So if you're a major, like pick your own operation, and you generally get, like several thousand people a year, but people are always getting lost. DOT may say, okay, yeah, you're 8 miles away from that interchange, but given how many people are reporting they're getting lost and that they're trying to get there, then it's worth having the sign. But if you get like 3 people a year, and you're 8 miles away, they're probably not going to put the sign up for you. So yeah, you have to furnish all of the panels, the signs, but the state, you would work with the state to do this. And then and the cost of that. So I don't know what it costs to actually make the sign, but it's, once again, it's once you've made that investment, it's $50 a year for the permit. So the question is it for you? First, the first sort of hurdle will be, are you within, you'd want to look at that map, going back, you'd want to sort of look at this map of the primary roads and figure out like, okay, like if you're over here, then having signs point to your business off of this road could make a lot of sense. But if you are like really far away and you're not within the circumference, and I don't know, like off the top of my head, I don't have a scale here. I would imagine that most of these are within 5 miles of a road. Then it might not make sense for you, or once again, it depends on like how many customers, you think you can get there. But as I said, like every person who drives by this, if you've got a road with a lot of traffic, every person who drives by sees your name and your business and has a sense of where it is. So you may end up then getting people who go back and said, wow, what is this vineyard? What do they do? Right. So it's a way of like just constantly staying, getting more people sort of thinking about your business. So those are the 2 New York State sign programs. So I guess if there's any questions about that, then I'm going to just sort of go into some tips for really thinking about signs. I saw there was one, temporary signs. Yeah. I don't know all of the rules everywhere around temporary signs. If you are if you put a temporary sign in a state right of way, yeah, I mean, they will take it away, and often, municipalities also have rules. I mean, because you always see those things proliferate during elections and stuff. And, and the town does have the right often to like get, pick them up and throw them away. So they may be regulated. It just may be that where you're placing it, nobody's taken it away yet. Um, but it doesn't mean that you have the right to do it. So if you're going to constantly have it up, or you're making a lot of investment in those signs, and you don't want to, you might want to find out what the rules are. They're smaller signs may be like less heavily regulated, but they are definitely they still fall under the regulations. So, all right. Yeah, I love New York. There's the DOT and I love New York. I would start with DOT. I think that they don't always get along. I would start with DOT, but they control what they control, which is their blue signs. The I Love New York signs would probably be through tourism. I know what you're talking about, but I'm not really sure how to fix that one, and I'm not sure if it's been improved. That was a that was a political issue. So tips for better signage. So the information, if you're thinking about like how big a sign to make, what to put on your sign, um, what colors to use, the first thing you want to think about is how fast is traffic moving near your proposed sign, right? Because if you think about it logically, and I'll go into like more detail, traffic that's moving slowly, people have more time to sort of see your sign and think about your sign before they have to make decisions. If people are moving fast and traffic is busy and it's moving fast, then people don't have as much response time. And so, so the size of the sign, the messaging that you put up there really, is more important, because there's a higher likelihood if you screw it up, people are just going to miss it. How far will your sign be from traffic? As you've seen, like DOT and it could be towns or whatever, they have setback rules. And so you probably can't put on many, especially busier roads, your sign right next to the road. You may have to put it to off at a distance to the side. And you also, so that's something to consider. And then you also, you may not be able like if, you may be trying to make it so that people can see it from further away. And then how big is your sign? Or do you have a size limit? Some towns, will through their zoning codes limit the size of the sign that you can put up. You can't always, put it, just because you can afford a ginormous billboard doesn't mean that you have the right to put up a ginormous billboard. And so that, that may limit, sort of how, what kind of design you have, depending on your location. So if you think about, promotional signage, the first thing is that signs have to be placed so that motorists have time to read the sign. So they see it, they read it, then decide, right? Like I see the sign and now I'm like, oh, like I'm hungry. I see something up there. Do I want to stop? And then if they decide yes or no, and then they have to slow down and then maybe make a turn, right? Like they can't do all of this instantly. And the speed that people are traveling at makes a big difference in how fast that, that all can happen. So if you're on a road where people are going generally about 25 miles an hour, then that whole read the sign and decide, they slow down and make turns. They need 250 feet to slow down and make a turn, right? So they, if it's 30 miles an hour, they need 300 feet to slow down and make a turn. If it's 50 miles an hour, they need 500 feet. If it's 70 miles, they need 700 feet. It's basically about for every 10 miles an hour, it's another 10, it's like 10 times that for the number of feet. So, so that's just to do the slow down and make a turn. So yeah, you assume 10 feet is needed for every mile an hour more that you're traveling. And so you still have to leave some time before that for them to read the sign and decide. So that would be like the minimum distance that people would need in order to, slow down and turn. So your sign is going to have to be like more than, if it's a 60-mile-an-hour road, that's people are going to need to see the sign more than 600 feet away, right? In order to like read it, make a decision, and then slow down and make a turn. So you're going to need either a bigger sign, or you're going to need that sign. You're going to need like some warning before the turn, like, like when you see on a map, like, the turn is in a quarter mile, right? Like you got to give people, some ability to like, to know that it's coming. Yeah, so I had an arrow there to point to that. So reading the sign, you want to keep your message brief. Like people who are driving, they talk about like lack of literacy. Anyway, people who are driving, like they have to like pay attention to traffic, and the busier that road is, the less, sort of bandwidth they have to like also like do a lot of reading. So your text should be concise with simple graphics, because, you want people, you want to get your point across. I thought this was like, okay, like if you go this way, you're going to have fun, right? Like that's a pretty easy sign to read. It doesn't necessarily tell you a ton about fun, but it tells you like that, it's fast, it's brief, it's concise, it's to the point. Because there's only like this guide here tells you how many words can you read based on the speed you're traveling and the distance from the sign. And there's a formula. So if you are, like we were talking about going down the road and you're going 30 miles an hour, so you need 300 feet to make the turn safely. If you are going 30 miles an hour, you can read, if you're 300 feet from the sign, you can read 20 words when you're 300 feet from the sign. If you are 500 feet from the sign, you have more time to read. You could read 34 words. But if you're only 50 feet from the sign, you can only read 3. You only have 3 words. You can only read 3 words before it's time to it's time to go at 30 miles an hour. At 70 miles an hour, you can see if you're 50 feet from the sign, you only have time to read a word. But if you're 500 feet from the sign, you can read 15 words. So the further away, because it gives you more time to read before you're right up against that sign. So you can, I think what this tells you is you need, if you're going to have people further away and you've got like a big message, you're going to need a pretty big sign so people can read it from really far away so that they have time to read that message. Whereas if you try to put a big message with a lot of words on a really, really tiny sign, nobody from 500 feet is going to be able to see that thing. And so they won't have time to read the message. And that gets to the next one, the letter height needed to read signs at various distances. And it's about 1 inch for every 30 feet. Although the minimum for traffic signs for if you're doing the DOT ones is at least 6 inches for a letter for uppercase and 4 inches for lowercase. But the rule of thumb as far as what people can see is about 1 inch for every 30 feet away for uppercase, and about 75%, of 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch lowercase for every 30 feet for people to be able to read it. So you can see once again, if you're 500 feet away, you need 16-inch letters for people to be able to read that. So if you've got a 15-word document, right, that you want people to read from 500 feet away at 16-inch letters, that's going to be a billboard, right? Like that's a big sign. And so all of these factors kind of like sort of play with each other to help you figure out like where do you want to put, how fast are people going, how much content do you want them to read. Kind of gives you a sense of how big a or how big a sign can I do will sort of maybe like put some constraints around how big a message can you do. So these are all, these three factors, the speed, the distance, and then the constraints around the sign size are all the ones that will factor into like what is your message, effective message going to be, to direct people into your business. So like, so if you can only have a 3 by 4 foot sign and people are going 50 miles an hour and they're going to need to turn 100 feet away, you can't do any more than 4 words, probably. So you can only do like you're going to want at least a 6-inch letter. If you're like a strawberry pick your own, maybe just 2 giant strawberries, and I probably would have put an arrow, might be all that people can read on that road. But that's enough to like get them to like know that they're at the right place. Like whereas if you had a long, like tiny little message saying like turn here for blah 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 farm, pick your road, 1 mile ahead, $2 entry fee or whatever, that's more than people can see at 50 miles an hour and deal with. So the other design tips, are that the sign should be consistent with other marketing messages and materials, and you want to like use the same colors, logo, graphics, fonts whenever possible to help build customer recognition of the farm. Um, Colors chosen for signs can affect visibility and legibility of the information. Using contrasting colors for the sign background and text allows the text to stand out more and make it easier to read. And they've done studies on like which combinations are the easiest for people to read. It's not necessarily the prettiest. What are the easiest? So, I put up sort of, this is a mixture. They had 18 examples. I have the 2 top ones, the 2 bottom ones, and 2 that are in the middle. And I'd be just curious to get a sense from the audience, like, which one do you think was the best as far as visibility from the road, color combination, and which one do you think was the worst color combination here? I guess maybe in the chat, if you want to just sort of type what letter you think is best and what letter you think is worst. You just sort of. So, yeah, everybody. Yeah, E is the worst. E is definitely the worst. Actually, this is the ranking. F and A were the 2 best. Good, strong contrast. The dark lettering I think is easier for people to read. And then yellow just is really eye-catching. Um, and E was the worst, and C was the worst. I think because they have the least contrast between the colors. And then B and D were in the middle. I think for a lot of farms, these are really attractive colors. So it's not like they're the worst. I mean, I'm not saying don't use green and white, don't use brown, don't use red, right? But like I would say, for example, if you're going to use red and white, you might want to have like a white sign with red as an accent color and black text if you want people to be able to read it, or maybe have like dark red letters on a white background rather than white letters or yellow letters on a red background, right? So just, just recognize that you really want to make sure that there's really good contrast there. And then, the other thing is font, easy to read font. And this is just sort of, I went and I picked a bunch of fonts, and they're all attractive. But, you want to think about, sometimes people have a font that's kind of funkier as their logo. But I just want you to like sort of look at these for a second and think about it. If you're driving 70 miles an hour down the road, what would be the easiest to read? Like if you've got messaging. And the key is that what you want is something that is like really, really, really clear. So I think this over on the far right, sort of the top row, the far right hand side, the farm stand, very clear, very easy to read. You know, whereas like the script ones are, you know, they could be really attractive, or very fine ones like this second from the left farm stand. Like that would be hard. Like you wouldn't get good contrast with something that is very thin like that. So that's just what you want to think about is like if you're picking a font for your signage, you want to make sure that it's, you know, very easy, clear, thick enough to be visible, really clear definition between the different letters. You know, these were all 24-point fonts, and you can see they're even very different sizes. And so like these are two examples of farms in my region that I've worked with. And I think they do a really good job with having like logos and fonts that are like, you know, they've given a lot of thought to this. I think the logos both represent the farm, right? Like you can get this really quick. If I'm driving down the road and I'm looking for Fox Creek Farm, they've done a really great job creating a very symbolic fox that I can identify as a fox at 50 miles an hour. Herd's apple farm is an apple pick your own, right? Like those two apples there. Like, okay, like if I can't even read herds because I'm like kind of distracted, I see apples that clues me in the red color that I'm in the right place. And then the other thing that these two have done really well is that they both have pretty clear, simple fonts. Herds is a little more stylized, but it's still not bad. Fox Creek Farm is also very clear, you know, font. And they've got good contrasting colors, text, and background. Like the graphics are not really detailed and complex. You know, there's if you're in the anywhere near the Catskill Park, I think one of the best examples of really bad signage are those Catskill Park little colorful signs that you'll see as you drive through the park that have like mountains on them. And I remember when they developed those, if you get up really close to them, it's a really pretty picture of like the mountains and the Catskills. But if you're driving past that at like 50 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, it's just a blue and green blur. Like you can't make out what any of that is, and you can't read. It says Catskill Park on it, you can barely read it. So that would be like, you know, like just as like homework or whatever, come visit the Catskills, look at those signs, they're terrible. And they spent a lot of money at the state, spent a lot of money on those signs. So, you know, it's possible to have a beautiful sign, a beautiful logo, beautiful graphics that are terrible as directional signage or wayfaring signage for your farm. So with that, I guess I don't know if there are any questions. All of